In this presentation, we're looking at the opposing side to Marquis, that of Jane English, who argues that abortion is often morally permissible. And like Marquis, though, English also agrees that the common arguments regarding abortion are problematic. And she argues that the two most common views are incorrect. Now, she uses the terms conservative and liberal to distinguish the views. Conservative, of course, being more like the pro-life view and liberal being the pro-choice view. And English argues that the conservative views are wrong to claim that since abortion is the taking of a human life, it's an act of murder. So she says the main reason that conservative views are incorrect is that they view that abortion is murder, and the justification for that is that human life, taking a human life intentionally, is murder. Now, the problem, she says, is that not all killings of humans, even intentionally, are murder. And on the flip side, she argues that liberal views are incorrect because they claim that a fetus, since a fetus does not become a person until birth, a woman can do whatever she pleases in and to her own body, including having an abortion. But she raises two challenges to this view. First of all, you can't do whatever you please if it affects others adversely. So if the fetus were a person, then clearly you couldn't do whatever you pleased if you were harming a person. So that's one problem. And on the second problem, English argues that even if a fetus is not a person, that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with it. And as examples, she says animals are not persons, but can't be tortured or killed for no reason. That is morally wrong to do so, even though they're not a person. So she concludes both of the classic views are wrong in their assumptions about what their views on abortion. So what are her main claims then in response? First of all, she argues that there is no single criterion for personhood, and no sharp line can be drawn on when a person is present. Now, often our concepts might be vague, and like baldness is a vague concept. It's not a sharp line when somebody is not bald and then when somebody is bald, for example. She argues that this is the case for personhood. Now notice, of course, some concepts this is true and some it's not. A light being on or off, for example. Most lights are either on or off. There's no vagueness to it. So her view is that when it comes to personhood, it's in that category of ideas and concepts that are vague. A second claim is that even if a fetus is a person, abortion may still be justifiable in many cases. And so that goes against a typical conservative view. And third, she argues that if a fetus is not a person, abortion may still be wrong in many cases, which would go against a liberal view. So even though generally speaking, English is of the pro-choice or liberal side, and she definitely gets to that conclusion, she does have criticisms of both sides. So first, let's look at the arguments for the claim that there is not a single criterion for personhood. Now, she considers some suggestions that have been made. What is it that makes something a person? So some people just point to the physical characteristics, genetic makeup, being able to breathe maybe. So a genetic makeup would be if something is a human. You might say that that's a person. Or psychological characteristics. We saw Marquis mention some of these, having sentience, that is self-awareness, awareness that one is a conscious being, being able to perceive something, or have a concept of self, the ability to use tools maybe, the ability to use language or humor that traditionally many people claim is a characteristic that only humans have. Or maybe the main focus should be on rationality, that is, having the ability to reason, to draw conclusions, to learn from past experience. Or maybe personhood is primarily something that is social, having the ability to work with others, to sympathize, to love, or to cooperate. And finally, maybe it's a legal concept that we should be emphasizing, being subject to law, having an ability to enter contracts, to have citizenship, maybe the ability to own property or the right to own property. So these are various criteria that different people have suggested that are necessary for something to be a person, or maybe sufficient. And English argues that any of the above fail taken individually. Now, usually we do consider a subset of these, maybe 2 or 3, or maybe all of them, but no particular set seems to be clearly both necessary and sufficient. So that's what we would want. We would want a definition of personhood that clarifies the necessary and sufficient criteria for being a person. And English says we don't have those. Some might be sufficient. Maybe being rational might be sufficient for being a human. Some might be necessary. But there is no clear set, she argues, that is both. And certainly the fetus has some of the criteria that we listed on the previous slide, having human genetic material, for example. Certainly the fetus would lack others, having the legal status to enter into contracts, for example. And some of the other characteristics might depend on the stage of development. Having the ability to breathe was one, where later in a pregnancy, a fetus would have that ability, but early would not. So what do we have to say in conclusion regarding personhood? Well, one thing that English points out is that we should be wary of fallacious claims where somebody presents a necessary condition, say having the proper DNA, and then that's identified as being in the fetus. And then it's concluded that the fetus is a person, which would be treating it as a sufficient condition. And of course, she notes that the fetus develops gradually, and that she argues we shouldn't expect a clear demarcation for when a fetus becomes a person. Now, I want to note that although at the beginning of the article, she seems to be careful in recognizing the difference between something being human and something being a person, she does not often recognize or use this difference. She's not always careful enough in this distinction. So just to be clear on why we would make a distinction here, something might be one and not the other. So someone who is clearly brain dead, for example, so we would consider this to no longer be a person because the individual is gone, somebody might say. They're just not there anymore. They're brain dead. They might still be a human. They would be a human if it's a living organism with human DNA, but not a person. Now, this might be a somewhat controversial example, but it seems like most people would agree that in that case, we would have a human, but not a person. And on the other hand, an extraterrestrial being that would be intelligent, rational, social, able to feel emotions and have empathy maybe for another person, that would be a person, but not a human, right? Some other kind of being. So you can be a person and not human. You can be a human and not a person. And it would be good to be really careful with this distinction, and English recognizes it, but occasionally she doesn't seem to stick with those distinctions. Okay, the second claim, that even if a fetus is a person, abortion may be justifiable in many cases. This is one of the main arguments of the article. This is probably the most important argument in the article to defend this claim, which would justify a person's right to have an abortion, which is English's view. So her argument is based on this idea that killing an innocent person may sometimes be justifiable. That would be the case in self-defense. And so she uses a couple stories to motivate this idea. Now, certainly our laws allow us to respond to threats of harm when an injury, with an injury that is somewhat greater than the harm threatened. So, for example, you may kill someone threatening to cut off your leg or threatening to rape you. Our laws would often, depending on the state and the details, but typically our laws would allow lethal response to those situations. But you would not have the reason to kill someone in order to have your clothes torn, for example. If someone explicitly said, I'm going to tear your shirt, and that's all I'm going to do, well, that wouldn't give you justification for killing the person in response. That might give you justification for hitting the person or knocking the person away from you. But it wouldn't give you justification to kill the person. So there are these laws that we have that are common in almost, well, in every state that allow self-defense. So here is an example. So we're pulling from, these are specific from California laws, and these are very traditional, standard, common. Many other states have laws almost exactly like this. And in California, it says that you act in lawful self-defense if you reasonably believe that you are in imminent danger of being killed, being seriously injured. So that would include, having your leg cut off, for example, would be a good example of that, the one that English mentioned, or unlawfully touched, which would, of course, include rape, or it might include molestation or something to that effect. And so that's one of the three criteria. You have to reasonably believe that you are in imminent danger of one of these things occurring. Second, you have to believe that immediate force is necessary to prevent the danger. So you have to believe that it is a situation where only lethal force will eliminate the danger, where screaming or yelling or telling the person to stop is not going to cut it. You need to take more force than that. And then finally, you use no more force than necessary to defend against that danger. So again, if you could scream or poke the person in the eye or kick the individual and have them stop the threat and have that stop the danger, that's what you should do. And presumably, of course, in situations where these are threatened, you would do those kinds of things. You would scream, you would fight back, if you're going to move on up to lethal force, you're going to do some of those other things first, right? But there's that limitation on self-defense. You're not to use more force than is necessary to alleviate the danger. So that's the typical kind of self-defense standards. Now, English does not include these standards in her article, but I thought since she is relying on the concept of self-defense, it would be good for us to examine some. Okay, so how does this work with abortion? A fetus may be innocent and still threaten the pregnant woman's well-being, either physically or mentally, to various degrees, right? And of course, we presume the fetus is innocent, right? Nobody's going to say it's intentionally harming a woman. Now, a slight threat does not warrant an abortion, just like a slight threat against a person doesn't warrant lethal force. So abortion for any reason at all may not be justified. Having an abortion because it would be inconvenient while being pregnant and taking a trip to Europe, English argues, would not be justified. But a woman has the right to free herself from the threat, although there is no right, English argues, to demand the death of the fetus. Now, that's actually a philosophical topic that is in contemporary journals that people are arguing about, whether there is a right to demand the death. English comes down on the sides of saying no, there is no right to demand the death of a fetus, which seems quite plausible. Now, in support of the underlying principle, this idea that even if a fetus may be innocent, you still might be in a position where there is a right to self-defense, she describes a situation where a surgeon is kidnapped by an innocent attacker who was hypnotized. So the person who is doing the kidnapping was innocent. It's just that they've been hypnotized to do this. And we'll just presume that that's possible. It does certainly seem possible. And the person is hypnotized to bring the surgeon to a mad scientist. Philosophers love stories with mad scientists. And the mad scientist plans to give her a permanent mental block that will render her unable to perform surgery and continue with her life work. So this is a pretty serious harm that is threatened. If the only way to avoid this occurring is to shoot your attacker, English argues then you have a right to do so. That the threat is at a level where you would have a right to shoot the attacker, even though, keep in mind, right, the attacker was innocent. They were just hypnotized to do this. They didn't plan to go out and cause you harm. And so that's a crucial point in the illustration. Just like a fetus is innocent, the attacker's innocent, but English argues if that's the only way to avoid this harm, then you have a right to shoot your attacker. Okay, so let's carry this out again and make sure that we're clear. In support of the underlying principle, English describes this surgeon kidnapped, hypnotized, mad scientist is going to give her a mental block. So she's all these things, and she's not going to be able to, the surgeon is not going to be able to continue with her life work. So if the only way to avoid this, we're reiterating this now, of course, to make sure we get the point. If the only way to avoid this is to shoot the attacker, you have a right to do so. And this case of the kidnapped surgeon is comparable, English argues, to a pregnancy that would prevent a woman from protecting her own life prospects. An example might be someone who is in law school and has to endure long hours of studying, make sure that she's taking the boards on time so that she can become an attorney, and this is her lifelong career aim. And so being pregnant would prevent her from fulfilling this career goal of hers, and that would be a situation where her life prospects are being threatened by the pregnancy. And so English argues that even though the fetus is innocent, an abortion would be justifiable. So a couple qualifications on the analogy. So English considers potential responses to her view and responds to those. This is always a good philosophical technique to anticipate potential objections and then provide responses. So English considers a situation where the attackers, now there are plural, they only come out at night, the ones that might kidnap you and take you to the mad scientist. So you could avoid them by not going out at night. So somebody might say, well, if you go out at night and then you get kidnapped, you don't have a right to shoot the attacker to save yourself because you knew that was a danger when you went out at night. Now, she says this is analogous to those who view abstinence as the only acceptable way to avoid pregnancy. So she says this is like the pro-life side who says, well, look, if you're going to engage in sex, you know that you might become pregnant. So once you do become pregnant, you don't have a right to have an abortion, right? But she says that's too restrictive on one's life. It's too restrictive to not go out at night, and she says it's also too restrictive to expect not to have sex. Now, others say maybe you should take MACE, and that's going to be analogous to using birth control. So you go out at night, again, analogous to having sex. You use MACE, which is analogous to using birth control so that you can fend off the attacker or avoid the pregnancy. But if the MACE is not successful, then you have to succumb to the attacker. And if the method you're using for contraception fails, then you have to go through with the pregnancy. English disagrees on this point as well. And she says the self-defense model makes it clear why there's a distinction between allowing abortion and allowing infanticide, right? Many arguments for allowing abortions that say that abortions are morally permissible end up using criteria for personhood that also fail to apply to newborn infants, right? So some of the ones we mentioned, newborn infants don't have a sense of humor, don't have sympathy for other people, don't have the ability to legally engage in contracts. So if those are your criteria for personhood, by which you justify saying a fetus is not a person, you would also have to say that a newborn infant is not a person. And then it seems like that would justify infanticide. And in fact, a few philosophers have seen that implication, but gone ahead and acknowledged it and said that yes, infanticide is morally justifiable in many cases because of the arguments for abortion. Now, English is careful to point out that would not be the case because presumably the infant that is already born is no longer threatening an individual's life prospects. The infant could be given up for adoption, for example. Okay, third claim. If the fetus is not a person, abortion may still be wrong in many cases. So here's where she goes against the traditional liberal view to a certain extent. And the main reason she says that we should accept this claim is that non-moral beings, which she's presuming a fetus is, while not having a moral status as human persons, still get some consideration in our moral code. That is, for example, it's wrong to torture dogs for amusement, even though dogs are not moral beings, they're not persons. It's wrong to shoot wild birds for no reason, English argues, even though wild birds do not have moral status, they're not human persons. So you can't do just whatever you want with these beings, even if they're not persons. And she says, likewise, even if fetuses are not persons, they should still have consideration in our moral code. And she goes on to explain this, that there's reason to grant moral status to a fetus to some degree, and part of the reason involves psychological factors. In order for a moral code to be effective, we should respect non-persons that are person-like, and the more person-like, the more we should respect the non-persons. And she describes that there was once this horror story of nurses who had to alternate back and forth between caring for babies born prematurely, 30 weeks, maybe even earlier than that, and then disposing of 24-week aborted fetuses. And to go back and forth when these looked very similar, one you're trying to save, one you're throwing away, literally, the nurses suffered greatly psychologically. This was extremely challenging, and the two are just too similar. and that causes psychological trauma to do this. Now, currently, those situations have been avoided, right? You wouldn't have a nurse doing both of those things. You would have one nurse who's dealing with abortion. You would have another nurse dealing with preemies. And of course, there's also this concern that there is bodily continuity between a fetus and an adult, and that also makes it reasonable to have some respect for a fetus. The fetus resembles a person in very important ways, even if it's not a person. Okay, concluding view. English sums up the view that she has by saying, look, the arguments she has, based on self-defense, justifying abortion in many cases, support a distinction like the Supreme Court made among the different trimesters. So where the first trimester, you really shouldn't have any restrictions for the sake of the fetus. It's only until the third trimester that you would have that. Earlier pregnancies then could be terminated without the same concerns that are involved in later term pregnancies. So the concerns about life prospects standards might be lower, so to speak, so that just not wanting to go through the inconvenience of a pregnancy and birth would be justifiable in the early stages, but not in the later stages. So that's English's view. There might be some questions to consider here. Would an abortion for the sake of life prospects meet the criteria for killing as self-defense? So English's argument depends on self-defense principles. Now recall what those principles included, that the laws only mention imminent danger of being killed, seriously injured, or unlawfully touched, which is usually clarified as rape or very significant molestation. Does the elimination of life prospects fit into either of those three categories? That's a question to consider. And while attempting to avoid the issue of personhood, English assumes that the fetus is not a person with moral status in the first two trimesters. If she's consistent with the Supreme Court, she does in fact assume that the fetus is not a person, right? If the fetus were a person, she would want to make it much more restrictive so that it's only those situations in which one's life prospects are seriously threatened that would justify allowing an abortion at any point during the pregnancy, right? If the fetus is a person, you would have to have those same reasons for allowing an abortion. But it seems she assumes then early in the pregnancy, she just assumes that the fetus is not a person. So that might cause a little bit of question about the permissiveness of even early abortions, early term abortions, on the justification that English provides. Those are just a couple things to ponder about her view.